That's genuine news.
Yeah.
Wow.
They're speculating next year, and they're speculating the 2.5 liter Subaru engine.
With the turbo, right?
Possibly.
I don't know why I don't want to discriminate, but if I'm looking at that kind of Subaru, it's like, it's got to have a turbo.
Yeah, but
that's what makes them fun.
Yeah, but I think they're at a good spot with the price point now. So if you add a turbo, I think it's gonna
a few G's. You think?
And at that point, you might as well just buy the Nissan. What is it, 370Z?
Those are pretty sweet.
Yeah, those are cool.
Sweet.
Yeah.
But shifting from that, today we're in the studio. We being myself and my co-producer Kyle.
Hey, everybody.
We're in the studio to talk about coolant contamination, how it shows up in testing, why it's a problem, the importance of what engine you have, and how we might be able to direct you to potential issues that might be allowing coolant, so on and so forth. But just to get the ball rolling, why is coolant contamination a problem? For the uninitiated, coolant is a problem when it reaches the engine oil because it causes rapid oxidation. It causes the oil to lose its lubricity, and if it goes unattended, eventually the oil is going to become so overly oxidized it will solidify, obviously causing a lot of internal wear. So that's why it's such a big issue for engines. And Kyle, just to get our listeners going on this topic, why don't you tell us a little bit about how coolant shows up in testing?
All right, so the markers we use for coolant are potassium and sodium. Now, if you look at any of your reports, you might see sodium's at about 7 to 10 parts per million. That's when it's not used as a main detergent and dispersant. When it is used as a major detergent and dispersant, you'll see 300 to 350 in something like a Valvoline oil.
Yeah, right. With a Valvoline product, you're going to see often a sodium level in that range. If you even pick a brand like Brad Pen, you might see it even upwards of 400 parts per million. So trust that when we're looking at one of your reports, we're always watching that sodium level and we're keeping in mind whether it could be an additive based on the level that shows up. We're not going to bother you with really, really low amounts that don't suggest coolant.
Mm-hmm.
Potassium's a little different though, because potassium is not going to be in an oil to begin with. So a lower amount, something like 20 parts per million, we're really going to key on that because that could indeed show coolant. But again, there's a lot of ifs, ands, and what have yous when it comes to even potassium, and that extends to aftermarket additives like Arch Oil and Revex, right?
Yeah, with which Arch Oil and Revex, you'll see potassium around the thousands range, and sodium's going to stay relatively low.
And another thing to keep in mind, too, with Arch Oil and Revex, and we'll just state right off the bat, those are harmless additives. They're just alternative sources for potassium and sodium. But when they're used in the oil, you're going to see a lot of potassium, like Kyle said. You're also going to see a lot of boron. So if we look at a sample with a 1,000 parts per million of potassium, and we also see a similar level of boron, then that's a good clue to us that you're probably using Arch Oil and Revex. So even if you send us a sample in and you forget to mention one of those additives, we're going to have a pretty decent idea, which is why we won't simply throw a positive for coolant contamination just because we found 1,000 parts per million of potassium, or we found that level of sodium that could be additive. We know how these things can look, but when there's gray area, which there often is when we don't have complete sample info and people will maybe forget to list the brand or blend of oil they run, they might forget to list an additive like Arch Oil or Revex. This is why we sometimes put a question mark for coolant on reports. I think a lot of people, Kyle, assume that coolant is just a positive or a negative test.
Yeah.
And that's not really the case.
No, it's not. Another case where we see potassium is a diesel engine. Potassium is used in a flux compound, but usually that's accompanied with aluminum. So That might be a situation where if aluminum doesn't look as high, we might put a question mark just because potassium looks a bit off.
We're going to take the big picture into account. We're going to look at if it's a diesel and high potassium shows up. Well, if it's a younger diesel and we find the high aluminum to go along with it that suggests harmless flux compound, that's another instance where we might put a question mark on there. So I think it's a good thing to kind of really get out in the clear in this episode The question mark is not because we just simply don't have a good way to detect coolant. The long and the short of it is there's more than one explanation for both potassium and sodium to show up, and it can be harmless. So it's not a simple result of us not being able to analyze your oil. We merely want to leave room for exceptions, especially when they can apply, like a young diesel where the customer might have forgot to mention an additive like Arch Oil or Revex. It will sometimes be more appropriate to put a question mark in there. But when we put positive, which, by the way, we abbreviate as POS, which some people would refer to their vehicle as a POS once they find out there's coolant in there. When we put positive on there, it's because we find a level of potassium and a level of sodium together that just suggest coolant. Maybe it's a diesel and you have high sodium, and diesel engine oils, well, they don't use sodium. So we find that high level of sodium, we find an accompanying amount of potassium. Those are instances where we're going to feel pretty comfortable putting positive on there. But so often there are times when folks don't remember the particular brand or blend they're running, which is perfectly fine. So many people, they go to a quick change place to get their oil changed. And I don't blame them for not knowing what was put in there.
Yeah, and even dealers too. There's not a lot of places that will advertise the exact oil they're putting in your car.
Precisely. And dealerships, quick change places, they get bulk supplies of oil. And, God bless it. I can't expect the tech who is doing the oil change to know where they got their last bulk supply, if it might have been a supplier that uses sodium in the oil. Can't blame them. I also can't blame the guy who's maybe has more than one vehicle at home and he buys different kinds of oil depending on, what's on sale. Can't blame him. It's just a situation where we will leave some gray area. We allow for some exceptions. If you just have a sodium level that could be from oil additive, we'll recognize that. But we also, we want to factor in other things too, like engine wear. If you have very healthy wear across the board, that's another scenario where we might not be so quick to go ahead and call a coolant problem. If we just see, in a diesel, for example, we might see a marginal amount of potassium. And for some people who've done some research on their own, or if you've listened to this show and you hear that potassium's a marker for coolant, well, if you have healthy wear across the board, just a slightly high level of potassium and not much sodium, the other marker for coolant, then that's another instance where we don't want to jump to any conclusions right off the bat.
Yeah. And on the topic of wear, sometimes we see an engine that has a coolant leak for multiple oil changes. That's not really a death sentence for that vehicle, especially if it's a specific use vehicle like a winter beater or something. You could probably go a long time with an antifreeze leak, and as long as you just keep an eye on it, it doesn't necessarily mean the engine's out the door. Yeah,
and that's really just a good segue into our next topic, which is if we do find coolant, what's the next step? And yeah, for those cars that it might not be your prized possession, it might just be your daily driver, and you find out it has a coolant issue. Albeit a small one, for example, that doesn't mean we're telling you right away to run to the shop, get it fixed. Of course, in some cases, you're going to have to,
Yeah, you might have to eventually at some point, but let's say it's, it's a small leak. You don't have to, you can put it off until the money's there or you're in a better position to replace that vehicle.
Because, yeah, at the end of the day, getting a analysis done is going to be a whole lot cheaper than fixing a leak, and the benefit of getting more than one analysis, building some trends, is you'll be able to see how bad the problem is, if it's steadily getting worse, if it's something that's minor and it's staying minor, then you might be able to hold off on really expensive repairs, going without your car for a long time, worrying about this, that, and the other. You can simply get analysis, every oil change, see how it's doing. And I promise, I don't know. Maybe you have a hookup with some repair shops and you're able to really get cheap work done. But really, for most people, managing a coolant leak when it's not so serious, oil analysis can be a huge benefit.
Yeah. So when you say, getting worse and not too serious, what exactly would a minor leak look like compared to a major catastrophic leak?
So in testing a minor leak, I would say would be one where you have potassium and sodium, maybe not exceeding 100 parts per million of either one. In some cases it can. It's tough to make an across the board generalization. But often you'll see leaks where potassium and sodium might be somewhere between 50 and 100 parts per million. It certainly high enough to indicate coolant. But when you have levels like that, for example, and you have wear metals that are really holding pretty steady, that would be a good scenario where the leak might not require, urgent repairs. Obviously, if you're able to fix a coolant leak, that's the best thing to do. But that's a good example, I suppose, where folks can kind of let it ride and get away with it for a long time. It's something where you're obviously going to have to be diligent about topping off the coolant reservoir as needed to avoid an overheat situation, which can obviously turn things bad a lot faster. But yeah, there are a lot of scenarios we come across where folks can manage the situation through oil analysis to see how that engine is doing. And if we see a pattern that suggests, hey, this could be any day now. We don't know. The engine's wearing terrible.
Yeah, when we throw out the lines like look out for strange noises and caution, that's when things might be getting kind of dire.
Exactly. And that's another thing I always kind of want to let customers know. We really tell it like it is in the comments. We're not shy. If we see something that truly looks bad, we're probably going to throw out words like caution, severe. I think a pretty common follow-up to a report where we tell folks they have a coolant leak, we'll get a phone call or an email, and they'll say, how bad is it? How much longer do I have left, doctor? Like that kind of thing. And yeah, I just like to remind our listeners, our customers, everyone, in our comments, we are going to be as sincere as possible. We're not holding back. We're not stopping short of describing the problem in its purest form. We're going to tell you everything we know because we want to help you out. And when we want to help you out, it's crucial we have all the information, especially the engine you've got.
Yes, yeah. There might be some insight that we can give you based on what we've known from previous cases.
Right. We really do our best to keep track of customer feedback on their engines, whatever they're sampling. Some engines are known for certain issues. I can't tell you how many times, we've seen a head gasket leak in this, that, or the other engine. So what we'll do is, depending on the engine you have, if we detect a problem, we can at least lend a little bit insight. We'll say, head gaskets are a common issue on this one. Lower intake manifold problems are a common issue here. We'll at least try and point you in the right direction. Unfortunately, though, what we do have to come out and say is, when we detect coolant from a head gasket problem versus coolant from a warped cylinder head, it's going to look the same. However it got there, it's still the same elements. And for that reason, we do have to stop short of saying with 100% certainty. However, we're going to do everything we can with the experience we've had with certain engines, and we're going to give you all the information we've got in helping you to address that problem. So if you're worried about a coolant problem, and that's something you want us to look for in your sample, and you haven't sampled with us before, all you need to have is a standard analysis. And that's going to run $28. Standard analysis is going to cover a spectral exam. It's going to cover viscosity, flashpoint, insolubles test. But the nice thing about this complete package when you're looking for a coolant problem is that we're going to be able to see how coolant is affecting the engine, affecting the oil's condition. So if you're worried about a coolant problem, we're going to use that standard analysis to look for it. And B, we're going to be able to tell you how the engine is wearing as a result if coolant is present. Hopefully it's not. Hopefully you have a healthy engine. We're going to be able to tell you if it's impacting the viscosity, if the oil is overly oxidized based on the insolubles result. So we're going to package that all together. And then obviously the benefit is you have a standard analysis. We're going to be able to help rule out other potential issues. You know, we're going to at least hopefully give you some good news in relation to how air and oil filtration are doing, if fuel's a problem, so on and so forth. So if it's something you're worried about and it's your first time sampling, just send in your sample with a slip. Just request standard analysis. To be frank, even if you don't write that, that's what we're going to more often than not assume if you send in a gas diesel engine sample.
Yeah. So that about wraps up this week's episode on antifreeze leak. Go ahead, comment, subscribe. That really helps us out.
Yes, please.
Yeah, tell your friends about us.
Any feedback you have, don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, whatever platform you're listening on. And we'll be back with you soon. Thanks for listening.
All right. Bye, everybody. So instead of a blooper this week, where we thought it'd be appropriate to do a Super Bowl prediction, where we are in the season, the Super Bowl is tomorrow. You know, the episode comes out the following Monday, so we thought it'd be cool to put in our predictions, and maybe you guys can tell us how wrong we were.
What better way for your hosts to humble ourselves than to throw out a prediction that might end up being terribly wrong, but we got to do it for the listeners. So for the uninitiated, the big game this weekend, we have San Francisco, Kansas City. Right now, Kansas City is a 1.5-point favorite. I'm going against the line on this game. I like San Francisco plus the points. Easy win. I'm throwing out that just to really stick the dagger in if I end up being wrong. The point total is, I think, 54 right now. And I like that game to go under the total. I think I want 35 to... let's go with 35 to 17.
See, that's interesting because my prediction is Kansas City winning 35 to 17, just to spite you.
Of course, it's only right. It's only right that we go against each other. Yeah, let us know in the comments how wrong we were. Thanks for listening.
All right, bye, guys.